The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across Deer Lodge, Montana, as Genevieve Norton stood before the church altar, tears streaming silently down her pale cheeks. It was 1872, and at 22 years of age, she was being married to Harold Wilder, the 40-year-old owner of the largest cattle ranch in the territory, a man known for his heavy drinking and cruel temper. "Do you, Genevieve, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Pastor Miller's voice seemed to come from miles away as she stared at the bouquet of wildflowers trembling in her hands. From the back of the church, Preston Abernathy watched with a clenched jaw, his hat crushed between white-knuckled fingers. The 30-year-old cowboy had only been in Deer Lodge for 6 months, working as a ranch hand at the neighboring property. But it had taken him less than a day to notice Genevieve's gentle beauty and kind spirit, and only a week to witness the bruises Harold left on her wrists when he thought no one was looking. Genevieve's voice faltered, her blue eyes darting toward her father, who nodded firmly from the front pew. "She deserves better than that," Preston whispered to himself, too softly for anyone to hear, but the words burned in his chest like a brand. Everyone in town knew that Marcus Norton had arranged the marriage to save his failing general store. Harold's wealth would keep the family from destitution, and in exchange, he would get the beautiful young bride he'd been eyeing since she was barely 16. The transaction disgusted Preston, but he was just a cowboy with nothing to his name but his horse, his saddle, and a reputation as an honest worker. "I do," Genevieve finally said, her voice hollow. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. Preston slipped out before the final blessing, unable to watch any longer. He mounted his chestnut stallion and rode hard back to the Silverhorn Ranch where he worked, the wind cooling the angry heat in his face, but doing nothing for the fire in his heart. That evening, as the wedding celebration continued at Harold Wilder's grand house on the hill overlooking town, Preston sat alone on the bunkhouse porch, staring at the distant lights and nursing a cup of coffee. "You look like you lost your best friend," said Hank, the grizzled old ranch foreman, settling onto the bench beside him. "Worse," Preston replied. "I watched a woman get sentenced to a life of misery today." Hank followed Preston's gaze toward the Wilder property. "Ah, the Norton girl. Pretty little thing." "She's more than pretty," Preston said quietly. "She reads poetry to the children at the schoolhouse on Saturdays, brings food to old Mrs. Henderson every Tuesday, never passes a person without a kind word. And now she belongs to the meanest drunk in the territory," Hank finished with a sigh. "That's the way of the world, son. Rich men get what they want." Preston shook his head. "It doesn't have to be, but what could he do?" The law was clear. A wife was her husband's property, as surely as the cattle that roamed his land. Still, as he watched the celebration lights twinkling in the distance, Preston made a silent promise to himself that he would find a way to help Genevieve Norton, now Genevieve Wilder, if the chance ever came. He didn't have to wait long. 3 weeks after the wedding, Preston rode into town for supplies. As he tied his horse outside the general store, he heard a crash from inside, followed by Marcus Norton's anxious voice. "Now, Harold, be reasonable. She's still learning to be a proper wife." Preston stepped through the doorway to find Harold Wilder looming over the counter, a whiskey bottle dangling from his hand. The store was empty of other customers, but Genevieve stood in the corner, her hand pressed to her cheek, her eyes downcast. "A proper wife doesn't embarrass her husband in front of the entire town," Harold slurred, swaying slightly. "Couldn't even serve the dinner without dropping the damn platter." When Harold raised his hand again, Preston moved without thinking. In 3 strides he was across the room, his hand closing around Harold's wrist. "That's enough," he said, his voice low but firm. Harold's bloodshot eyes widened with surprise before narrowing in fury. "Get your hands off me, Cowboy. This is between a man and his wife. Not when you're raising your hand to her in public. It isn't." Preston didn't release his grip. Genevieve looked up, her eyes meeting Preston's for the first time. The left side of her face was reddened, the beginning of what would surely become a bruise blooming across her cheekbone. "Please," she whispered. "He doesn't mean it. He's just had too much to drink." "Listen to my wife, Cowboy," Harold sneered, yanking his arm free. "She knows her place." Preston stepped back, but his eyes remained locked on Harold's. "A real man doesn't need to strike a woman to prove his strength, Mr. Wilder. And a hired hand doesn't need to tell me how to treat my property," Harold spat. He grabbed Genevieve roughly by the arm. "Come on, we're going home." As Harold dragged her toward the door, Genevieve glanced back at Preston, and in that brief moment, he saw something that made his heart race. Gratitude, yes, but also a flicker of something that might have been hope. Marcus Norton approached Preston as soon as the couple had left. "You shouldn't have interfered," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Now he'll take it out on her at home." "Is that what helps you sleep at night?" Preston asked, unable to keep the disgust from his voice. "Telling yourself it would have happened anyway." The older man's face crumpled. "What was I supposed to do? We were going to lose everything, the store, our home. I thought he would treat her well, he promised. Promises from men like that aren't worth the air they're spoken with." Preston turned to leave, then paused. "How often does he hit her?" Marcus looked away. "It wasn't like this before the wedding. He was charming, generous, but now, it's getting worse. The drinking, the anger, I fear for her." "Then do something about it," Preston said. "What would you have me do?" The law," Preston cut him off, "doesn't say a father can't visit his daughter, keep an eye on her, let her know she's not alone." He placed his hat back on his head. "And if things get bad enough, well, sometimes the law isn't the final word on what's right." With that, Preston left the store, his errand forgotten. His blood was still boiling as he mounted his horse and turned toward the ranch, but now his anger had purpose. He would find a way to help Genevieve, he just needed to be patient and watch for an opportunity. The opportunity came sooner than expected. 2 days later, Preston was repairing fence line on the far side of the Silverhorn property when he spotted a figure on horseback crossing the open meadow. Even from a distance, he recognized the delicate posture and honey-colored hair. Genevieve was riding hard, looking back over her shoulder repeatedly as if fearing pursuit. Preston whistled for his horse and intercepted her path. As he drew closer, his stomach tightened at the sight of her. A purple bruise marked her cheek, and her bottom lip was split and swollen. "Mrs. Wilder," he called, keeping his voice gentle despite his rage. She pulled her horse to a stop, clearly startled. "Mr. Abernathy, I didn't see you there. Are you running away?" he asked directly. Genevieve's shoulders slumped. "I thought I was, but I don't know where to go." "My father won't take me back. He's too afraid of Harold. I have no other family." "He did this to you?" Preston gestured to her face, though the answer was obvious. She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "He came home drunk last night. Said I'd been making eyes at the banker's son when we were in town yesterday. I wasn't, I swear. I barely spoke to him." "I believe you," Preston said softly, he said. Her voice broke. "He said next time he'd teach me a permanent lesson. I was so afraid I waited until he passed out and then I just ran." Preston glanced back toward town. "He'll come looking for you, I know, but I couldn't stay." She looked at him with desperate eyes. "What should I do?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Helping a married woman escape her husband was no small matter. It could mean his job, his reputation, maybe even his life if Harold Wilder caught up to them. But looking at Genevieve's bruised face and the terror in her eyes, Preston knew there was only one answer he could give. "Come with me," he said. "I know a place where you can rest while we figure this out." Relief washed over her features. "Thank you," she whispered. Preston led her deep into the pine forest that bordered the ranch, following a narrow trail until they reached a small cabin nestled against the mountainside. This was the original homestead before they built the main ranch house, he explained as he helped her dismount. "No one comes here anymore except me. I like the solitude sometimes." The cabin was simple but clean, with a stone fireplace, a small table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed pushed against one wall. Preston quickly got a fire going while Genevieve stood uncertainly by the door. "You'll be safe here for tonight," he assured her. "I'll bring you food and water, and tomorrow we can figure out what to do next." "I can't ask you to risk yourself for me," she said, though her eyes betrayed her hope. "You didn't ask, I offered." Preston moved toward the door. "I need to get back before I'm missed, but I'll return at sunset. Lock the door behind me." As he started to leave, she caught his arm. "Why are you helping me? You barely know me." Preston looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then met her eyes. "Because I've seen the kindness you show others, even when your own life is hard. Because I believe everyone deserves happiness." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "And because from the first moment I saw you, I couldn't look away." A blush crept across her cheeks, bringing a brief moment of life to her battered face. "Be careful, Mr. Abernathy." "Preston," he corrected with a small smile. "And I always am." True to his word, Preston returned at sunset with food, fresh water, and a change of clothes he'd managed to borrow from the ranch owner's daughter, who was about Genevieve's size. He found her sitting by the window, staring out at the darkening forest. "No sign of anyone searching this far out," he reported as he set down his bundles. "He'll be looking," Genevieve said, turning to face him. "Harold doesn't like to lose what he considers his property." The bitter edge to her voice was new, and Preston was glad to hear it. Anger was better than fear. It would give her the strength to keep going. "Let him look," Preston said, unpacking bread, cheese, and dried meat onto the table. "By the time he thinks to search this far from town, we'll have figured out our next step." Genevieve approached the table cautiously. "Our next step? You're planning to come with me, if you'll have me," Preston replied. "I'm thinking Denver might be a good place to start over. Big enough that 2 people can disappear, far enough that Wilder's influence won't reach." "But your job, your life here," she protested. Preston shrugged. "I'm a cowboy. I can find work anywhere cattle need tending." He didn't mention that he'd already made up his mind to leave with her the moment he saw her riding across that meadow. They ate in comfortable silence, and afterward, Preston taught her how to play poker with a worn deck of cards he kept in the cabin. For brief moments, she would laugh at his jokes or concentrate intently on her cards, and he could see glimpses of the woman she might have been without the weight of fear and abuse. As the night grew late, Preston prepared to leave. "I'll sleep in the lean-to out back," he told her. "I'll be close if you need anything." Genevieve caught his hand before he could go. "Thank you," she said simply, but her eyes conveyed much more. Preston squeezed her fingers gently. "Get some rest, Genevieve. Tomorrow is the first day of your new life." The lean-to was cold and cramped, but Preston hardly noticed. His mind was racing with plans and possibilities. They would need money for train tickets, supplies for the journey, and a story to explain why they were traveling together. And they would need to leave soon, before Harold Wilder's search expanded to include the Silverhorn property. Preston was just drifting off to sleep when the crack of a branch snapping jolted him awake. He reached for the revolver he kept tucked in his belt, listening intently. The night was still for a long moment, and then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching the cabin. Moving silently, Preston crept around the side of the cabin, staying in the shadows. In the faint moonlight, he could make out two figures, one short and round, the other tall and lean, moving cautiously toward the front door. "You sure she's here, Jimson?" asked a voice Preston recognized as belonging to Tom Riley, one of Harold Wilder's ranch hands. "Tracked her horse clear as day," responded the other man. "Trail leads right to this old cabin." Preston's stomach dropped. He hadn't thought to hide the horses better, assuming no one would search this far before morning. A rookie mistake that might cost them dearly. "Wilder's offering $50 to whoever brings her back," Tom said, his hand moving to the gun on his hip. "Said we don't need to be gentle about it." That was all Preston needed to hear. Stepping out from the shadows, he cocked his revolver. "That's far enough, boys." Both men froze, turning slowly to face him. "Well, look at that," Jimson drawled. "Preston Abernathy playing hero. You know harboring another man's wife is against the law." "So is hunting people like animals," Preston replied evenly. "Turn around and ride back to Wilder. Tell him you didn't find anything." Tom laughed harshly. "Two against one, Abernathy, and $50 is $50. "I'm not looking for trouble," Preston said, his aim steady, "but I'll make sure you find it if you take another step toward that door." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then the cabin door creaked open and Genevieve stepped out, holding Preston's rifle. "He's not alone," she said, her voice surprisingly steady as she leveled the weapon at Tom's chest. Jimson swore under his breath. "Mrs. Wilder, be reasonable. Your husband's worried sick about you. Come back peaceful-like, and I'm sure he'll forgive this little misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Genevieve replied, "and I'm never going back to him. Not alive, anyway." The determination in her voice seemed to give the men pause. Tom glanced at Jimson, clearly rethinking the situation. $50 ain't worth dying over," Preston reminded them. "And that's what'll happen if you try to take her." After a moment of silent communication, Jimson nodded grudgingly. "Fine. Have it your way for now." "But Wilder won't stop looking. You know that." "Then we'll be long gone before he finds us," Preston said. "Now mount up and ride out, and if you value your health, you'll give us at least until morning before you report back." The men retreated slowly, keeping their eyes on Preston's gun until they reached their horses. As they rode away, Preston turned to Genevieve, who was still clutching the rifle with white knuckles. "We need to go," he said urgently. "Now. They won't wait until morning to tell Wilder where we are." Genevieve nodded, lowering the rifle. "I heard everything. I've been packed and ready since you left." Preston smiled despite the danger. "You're braver than you know." They worked quickly, gathering their few belongings and saddling the horses. Within 15 minutes, they were riding north through the forest, away from town and the most obvious routes. "Where are we going?" Genevieve asked as they pushed through a dense patch of pine trees. "I have a friend who runs a hunting lodge about 30 miles from here," Preston explained. "We can rest there tomorrow, then catch the eastbound train from Garrison the day after." "And Harold won't think to look there," Preston shook his head. "My friend doesn't much care for law or authority. He won't give us up, even if Wilder comes asking." They rode through the night, following game trails and stream beds to mask their tracks. Genevieve never complained, though Preston could see the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders as dawn approached. Finally, as the sun crested the eastern mountains, they stopped in a small clearing to rest the horses. "You're doing well," Preston told her as he helped her dismount. Her legs buckled slightly from hours in the saddle, and he caught her by the waist, steadying her. "I'm slowing you down," she said, frustration evident in her voice. "We're making good time," he assured her. "And you're riding better than most men I know who have been on a horse their whole lives." A small, proud smile crossed her face. My grandfather taught me before he died. My father never approved, said it wasn't ladylike, but those lessons are serving me well now. Preston handed her a canteen of water. Your grandfather sounds like a wise man. He was. She took a long drink, then asked the question that had clearly been on her mind. What happens when we reach Denver? Preston sat on a fallen log, considering his answer carefully. That depends on what you want. I have some savings enough to get you set up in a boarding house while you find work. Or, he hesitated, if you preferred, we could continue on together. As what? Genevieve asked quietly, her eyes searching his face. As partners, Preston replied honestly. I won't lie to you, Genevieve. I care for you more than I should given the circumstances, but I expect nothing in return for helping you. Your freedom is what matters most. She was silent for a long moment, her gaze dropping to the forest floor. I've never been free, she finally said. Not really. First my father's decisions ruled my life, then Harold's. I don't even know who I am without someone telling me. Preston reached out slowly, taking her hand. Then that's the first thing you'll discover in Denver, and I'll be there if you want me to be, watching you become yourself. Genevieve squeezed his hand, a new determination setting her jaw. I want that, and I want you with me, Preston. Not because I need protection, but because when I'm with you I feel possibilities. The simple honesty of her words touched Preston deeply. Possibilities, he repeated with a smile. I like the sound of that. They rested for an hour, then continued their journey, staying off the main trails and keeping to the cover of the forest. By mid-afternoon, they reached a small valley where a rustic two-story lodge stood beside a clear mountain stream. That's it, Preston said, pointing to the building. Blackwater Lodge. My friend Silas has owned it for 20 years. Caters to hunters and trappers mostly, but he's been known to shelter the occasional person looking to disappear. As they approached, a tall man with a silver-streaked beard emerged from the front door, a shotgun held casually in the crook of his arm. When he recognized Preston, his weathered face broke into a wide grin. Preston Abernathy, what brings you to my neck of the woods? His smile faltered slightly when he noticed Genevieve, and with company, no less. Preston dismounted and stepped forward to shake the man's hand. Silas, we need a place to stay for the night and some discretion. Silas's sharp eyes took in Genevieve's bruised face, her borrowed clothes, and the way she sat her horse with exhausted determination. Trouble following you. Harold Wilder's kind of trouble, Preston confirmed quietly. Silas let out a low whistle. You never did things by halves, did you, boy? But he was already moving to help Genevieve down from her horse. Come inside, miss. My wife will fix you something to eat and draw a bath. You look like you could use both. Genevieve glanced uncertainly at Preston, who nodded encouragingly. Silas and Martha are good people. You'll be safe here. Inside the lodge, they were greeted by a plump, cheerful woman who took one look at Genevieve and immediately bustled her upstairs, promising hot water and clean clothes. Preston explained their situation to Silas, who listened gravely, occasionally nodding. Wilder's got a mean reputation, Silas said when Preston had finished. And a long reach. You sure Denver's far enough? It has to be, Preston replied. We don't have the money to go farther, not yet. Silas studied him thoughtfully. You love her. It wasn't a question. Preston didn't deny it. I hardly know her, but yes, I think I do. Well then, Silas clapped him on the shoulder. I suppose we'd better make sure you both live long enough to see where that leads. He moved to a cabinet and removed a bottle and 2 glasses. Martha will look after your lady friend. Meanwhile, you and I need to plan how to get you on that train without Wilder's men spotting you. They spent the next hour discussing routes and options. Silas confirmed that the eastbound train would pass through Garrison the day after tomorrow, which would give them time to rest and prepare. "I have a wagon heading that way with supplies," Silas told him. "You could ride in the back, covered by canvas." Much less conspicuous than two riders on horseback. "What about the horses?" Preston asked. "I'll keep them here," Silas offered. "If you decide to come back this way someday, they'll be waiting. If not, consider them payment for some of those poker debts I still owe you." Preston laughed. "You never owed me anything, old friend." "Well, I do now," Silas said seriously. "Taking on Harold Wilder for the sake of a woman's safety, that's the kind of debt a man's proud to acknowledge." Later that evening, after a hearty meal prepared by Martha, Preston found himself alone with Genevieve on the lodge's back porch. She had bathed and changed into a simple but clean dress that Martha had provided, and though the bruises on her face were still visible, there was a new lightness to her movements. "How are you feeling?" Preston asked as they watched the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. "Cleaner," she replied with a small smile. "Safer, more hopeful than I've felt in months." She turned to face him fully. "Thank you, Preston, not just for helping me escape, but for really seeing me when everyone else looked away." "I couldn't look away," he admitted. "Not from the first day I saw you in town, helping that old man with his packages when everyone else rushed past." Genevieve looked surprised. "You saw that? It was almost a year ago, just after you came to Deer Lodge." "I remember the exact date," Preston said softly. "April 18th. You were wearing a blue dress that matched your eyes, and you laughed at something the old man said. It was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard." A blush spread across her cheeks. "I didn't know anyone was watching." "I always was," Preston confessed. "Not in a way that should frighten you," he added quickly. I noticed the good things you did, the kindness you showed. It made the hard work days easier, knowing there was someone like you in the world." Genevieve was silent for a moment, considering his words. "No one has ever seen me that way before," she finally said. "As someone worth noticing for just being myself." "Then everyone else was blind," Preston said simply. She reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against his. "I'm afraid, Preston, not of Harold finding us well, not only that. I'm afraid that once we reach Denver, once the danger has passed, you'll realize I'm not the woman you think I am." Preston turned his hand, interlacing their fingers. "I don't have any illusions, Genevieve. I know you're not perfect, neither am I, but I see your heart and it's good. That's all that matters to me." Tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. "No one has ever spoken to me like you do." "Then I'll have to make up for lost time," Preston said with a gentle smile. "Because there's so much more I want to tell you, Genevieve Norton. And we have a whole future ahead of us to say it." She leaned forward then, resting her head against his shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but to Preston, it felt like the most profound expression of trust he'd ever received. He wrapped his arm around her carefully, mindful of her bruises, and together they watched as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. They spent the next day resting and preparing for their journey. Martha fussed over Genevieve, providing her with additional clothes and practical advice about starting over in a new city. Silas taught Preston a few alternate routes to Garrison in case they encountered trouble, and gave him a small revolver for Genevieve. "A woman traveling alone should know how to protect herself," he explained as Genevieve examined the weapon with a mixture of apprehension and determination. "I'm not traveling alone," she pointed out, glancing at Preston. "Even so," Silas insisted. "The world isn't always kind to women, especially those running from powerful men." In the afternoon, Preston took Genevieve to a small clearing behind the lodge and showed her how to load, aim, and fire the revolver. Her first shot went wild, the recoil stronger than she expected, but by the fifth attempt, She was hitting the tree they designated as a target with reasonable accuracy. "I never thought I'd be learning to shoot a gun," she said, a hint of wonder in her voice as she examined the weapon. "Does it bother you?" Preston asked. Genevieve considered the question seriously. "No," she decided. "It feels empowering, like I'm taking control of my own safety instead of relying on someone else to protect me." Preston smiled at her answer. "That's exactly the right way to think about it. Though I hope you never need to use it." "So do I," she agreed, tucking the gun carefully into the pocket Martha had sewn into her new dress specifically for this purpose. They left before dawn the next morning, concealed in the back of Silas's supply wagon beneath canvas and crates. The journey to Garrison would take most of the day, following winding mountain roads and crossing 2 rivers before reaching the small railway town. As the wagon creaked and swayed, Preston and Genevieve sat close together in the dim space, speaking in whispers despite being alone. "What will we do when we reach Denver?" Genevieve asked, her shoulder pressed warmly against his. "Find work, find a place to live," Preston replied. "I have a cousin there who works at a livery stable. He can probably help me find something similar." "And me? What skills do I have that anyone would pay for?" Preston considered her question. "You're educated, aren't you? You read to the children at the school." "Yes, my mother insisted I learn reading, writing, arithmetic, even a little French before she died." Genevieve's voice softened at the mention of her mother. "She wanted more for me than to just be someone's wife." "Perhaps you could teach," Preston suggested, "or work as a shop assistant. Denver's growing fast. There are opportunities for people willing to work hard." Genevieve nodded thoughtfully. "I've never had a real job before. Father didn't approve of women working outside the home." "Well, now you get to decide what you approve of," Preston reminded her, enjoying the way her eyes lit up at his words. They fell into comfortable silence, the gentle rocking of the wagon eventually lulling Genevieve to sleep. Her head drooped onto Preston's shoulder, her honey-colored hair spilling across his chest. He remained perfectly still, not wanting to wake her, savoring the trust implied by her peaceful slumber. Preston was nearly dozing himself when the wagon came to an abrupt halt, jerking them both awake. Muted voices reached them through the canvas ceilings speaking to someone on the road. Preston pressed a finger to his lips, signaling Genevieve to stay silent as he strained to hear the conversation. "Looking for a man and woman," came an unfamiliar voice. "Tall fella, dark hair, riding with a blonde woman. Might have passed this way yesterday or today." "Haven't seen anyone fitting that description," Silas replied easily. "Just me and my supplies, heading to Garrison for the monthly train delivery." "Mind if we check your wagon?" the voice asked, not quite a request. Preston's hand moved to his gun, and beside him, Genevieve did the same, her face pale but determined. "Actually, I do mind," Silas said, his tone hardening. "My business is my own, and I don't answer to Harold Wilder or his men." There was a tense pause before the other man spoke again. "No one said anything about Wilder." "You didn't have to," Silas replied. "Word travels fast in these parts. Now, if you boys don't mind, I've got a schedule to keep." For a heart-stopping moment, Preston thought the men might insist on searching the wagon anyway. He positioned himself protectively in front of Genevieve, ready to fight if necessary. But then came the sound of horses moving away and Silas's voice calling out, "Safe travels, gentlemen," followed by the crack of a whip and the wagon lurching forward once more. Several minutes later, Silas pulled back a corner of the canvas. "Wilder's men," he confirmed grimly. "2 of them, riding patrol on the main road. We're taking the long way to Garrison now through Miller's Pass." "Will we still make the train?" Preston asked. Silas nodded. "If we push hard." but be ready, they might have men watching the station too. The rest of the journey was tense, with every unexpected sound causing Genevieve to flinch and Preston to reach for his weapon. But they encountered no further trouble, and as dusk was falling, the wagon rolled into Garrison. Unlike Deer Lodge, Garrison was little more than a railway stop with a handful of buildings clustered around the tracks. Silas parked the wagon behind the general store and helped them disembark. "Train's due in 40 minutes, he told them, pressing a small pouch of coins into Preston's hand when he tried to pay for their passage. "Consider it a wedding gift." Preston started to protest, but Genevieve placed her hand on his arm. "Thank you, Silas," she said softly, "for everything." The old man's weathered face softened. "Be happy, you two. That'll be thanks enough." They hugged Martha goodbye, and then Silas led them through the gathering darkness to the small railway platform. Only a few other passengers waited: a young mother with 2 sleeping children, an elderly couple, and a businessman reading a newspaper. "Stay in the shadows until the train arrives," Silas advised. "I'll keep watch." Preston and Genevieve positioned themselves at the far end of the platform, partially concealed by stacked crates. The minutes crawled by, each seeming longer than the last. Preston kept his arm around Genevieve's shoulders, feeling the tension in her body. "Almost there," he murmured encouragingly. "Just a little longer." Finally, the distant whistle of the approaching train cut through the night air. Genevieve's hand found Preston's, squeezing tightly. "There," Silas suddenly hissed, pointing to 2 riders approaching the station from the east. "Wilder's men." Preston pulled Genevieve deeper into the shadows. "They've seen us." "Don't think so, but they're searching the platform. When the train stops, wait for my signal before you board." The train thundered into the station, brakes screeching as it slowed. Steam billowed across the platform, temporarily obscuring their view of Wilder's men. Passengers began disembarking while others moved forward to board. Through gaps in the steam, Preston could see the 2 men dismounting, moving systematically along the platform, checking each passenger. They were methodical, thorough, and getting closer. "Now," Silas suddenly called, moving forward to intercept the searchers, deliberately bumping into one of them and causing a loud argument that drew everyone's attention. Preston seized the moment, pulling Genevieve from their hiding place and hurrying her toward the nearest passenger car. They climbed aboard just as the conductor called the final boarding call, finding seats near the back of the car. Through the window, they could see Silas still engaged in his theatrical dispute, effectively blocking the men's view of the train. By the time he stepped aside with an exaggerated apology, the train was already beginning to move. One of Wilder's men looked up, his eyes scanning the departing cars, and for a heart-stopping moment, his gaze seemed to lock with Preston's through the window. The man shouted something to his companion, and both started running alongside the accelerating train. "Get down," Preston urged, pulling Genevieve below the window line as the men drew their weapons. A shot rang out, shattering a window several seats ahead of them. Passengers screamed and ducked for cover as the train picked up speed, pulling away from the platform and the pursuing men. For several tense minutes, Preston and Genevieve remained huddled together, hardly daring to breathe. Only when the train had rounded a bend, putting Garrison firmly behind them, did Preston cautiously rise to check out the window. "They're gone," he confirmed, settling back into his seat with a shaky exhale. "We made it." Genevieve emerged from her protective crouch, her face pale but composed. "Will they telegraph ahead? Try to stop us at the next station?" "Possibly," Preston admitted. "But Wilder's influence won't reach all the way to Denver. And the conductor will have reported the shooting. The authorities at the next station will be looking for the shooters, not us." As the adrenaline of their narrow escape began to fade, exhaustion overtook them both. Genevieve's head drooped against Preston's shoulder once more, and he wrapped his arm around her, keeping her close. "Rest," he murmured against her hair. "I'll keep watch." But despite his words, Preston found his own eyes growing heavy as the rhythmic clicking of the train tracks lulled him towards sleep. His last conscious thought was a prayer of gratitude that they had made it this far and a hope for what might await them in Denver. They changed trains twice over the next 2 days, always watchful for pursuers but encountering none. With each mile that passed, Genevieve seemed to shed some of the fear and hesitation that had marked her movements since Preston had known her. She spoke more freely, laughed more readily, and occasionally, when she thought he wasn't looking, would touch his arm or hand as if reassuring herself he was still there. By the time they reached Denver, Genevieve's bruises had faded to yellowish smudges, and a new determination had settled in her eyes. The city greeted them with noise, bustle, and a sense of possibility that made the dangers they'd fled seem distant. Preston's cousin, Ellis, met them at the station as arranged in a telegram sent from one of their transfer points. A barrel-chested man with Preston's same dark eyes, Ellis embraced his cousin warmly before tipping his hat to Genevieve. "So this is the brave lady I've heard so much about," he said with a friendly smile. "Welcome to Denver, Mrs. Norton." They had agreed to use Genevieve's maiden name, a small rebellion against Harold Wilder's claim on her. "Thank you for meeting us," Genevieve replied, her voice steady despite the overwhelming noise and movement of the busy station. Ellis led them to a waiting wagon. "I've arranged rooms for you both at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house," he explained as they drove through the crowded streets. "It's not fancy, but it's clean and respectable." "And work?" Preston asked, acutely aware of their dwindling funds. "Got you a position at Hollister's Livery starting tomorrow," Ellis confirmed. "And Mrs. Peterson mentioned she knows a dressmaker looking for an assistant, if that might interest the lady." Genevieve brightened at this. "I'm quite good with a needle," she said. "My mother taught me before she passed." Mrs. Peterson's boarding house was indeed clean and respectable if modest. The stern-faced but kind-eyed widow showed them to adjacent rooms on the second floor, explaining her rules in no-nonsense terms. "No gentlemen callers in the ladies' rooms, no spirits on the premises, and everyone contributes to Saturday cleaning," she declared, eyeing them both as if daring them to object. "Breakfast at 6, dinner at 7, and you're on your own for lunch. $2 a week, payable every Monday." "Yes, madam," Preston and Genevieve replied in unison. When Mrs. Peterson had left them in the hallway between their rooms, Preston turned to Genevieve with a smile. "Well, it's not the grandest accommodation, but it's safe, and it's a start." "A start," Genevieve repeated, her eyes shining with something that looked like joy. "Our start." Impulsively, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed a quick, soft kiss to his cheek. "Thank you, Preston, for everything." Before he could respond, she had disappeared into her room, leaving him standing in the hallway with his hand pressed to his cheek and his heart thundering in his chest. Next week's passed in a blur of new routines and adjustments. Preston worked long hours at the livery, while Genevieve secured the position with Mrs. Hartwell, the dressmaker. They saw each other at breakfast and dinner, sometimes walking together on Sundays when both had the day free. Denver was everything Deer Lodge wasn't: busy, diverse, full of possibilities. Nobody knew them here. Nobody judged Genevieve for being without a husband or Preston for being a simple cowboy. They were simply two more people trying to make their way in a growing city. One Sunday, about a month after their arrival, they visited a small park near Cherry Creek. The autumn air was crisp, the trees ablaze with red and gold leaves. They sat on a bench, watching children play and couples stroll arm in arm. "Are you happy here?" Preston asked, suddenly needing to know. Genevieve considered the question with the careful thoughtfulness he had come to cherish about her. "Yes," she finally said. "I wake up each morning and choose what I will do that day. I earn my own money and spend it as I see fit. I speak when I want to speak and remain silent when I prefer. These seem like small things, but to me—" Her voice trailed off, emotion making it difficult to continue. "They're everything," Preston finished for her. She nodded, blinking back tears. "And you, are you happy, Preston? You gave up so much to help me." "I gave up nothing of value," he replied honestly, "and gained everything worth having." He paused, gathering his courage. "Genevieve, there's something I need to tell you." She turned to face him fully, a flicker of concern crossing her features. "What is it?" "When we left Deer Lodge, I promised myself I wouldn't rush you, wouldn't pressure you with my feelings until you'd had time to find yourself, to heal." Preston took a deep breath. "But each day that passes, I find it harder to keep that promise. Because each day, I fall more in love with you." Genevieve's eyes widened, a flush spreading across her cheeks. "Preston, you don't need to say anything," he hurried to assure her. "I don't expect anything in return, I just couldn't keep it inside any longer." "No, you misunderstand," Genevieve said, reaching for his hand. "I'm not upset. I'm relieved." She smiled, a full, radiant smile that transformed her face. "Because I've been feeling the same way and I've been too afraid to say it." Preston felt as if his heart might burst from his chest. "You have." "Of course I have," she said softly. "How could I not? You saw me when no one else did. You risked everything to save me. And every day since, you've shown me what real love looks like: patient, kind, respectful." Preston lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "I want to court you properly, Genevieve Norton, if you'll allow it." "There's nothing I want more," she replied, her blue eyes shining. "But there's one problem." "What's that?" Preston asked, suddenly concerned. "I'm still legally married to Harold Wilder," she reminded him, her expression clouding. "As far as the law is concerned, I'm a runaway wife. We can't. There can't be anything official between us." Preston had considered this problem often over the past month. "Actually, I've been speaking with a lawyer friend of Ellis's about that very issue. He says you have grounds for divorce due to cruelty. It won't be easy and Wilder will likely contest it, but it's possible." Hope bloomed in Genevieve's eyes. "Truly, I could be free of him legally." "The lawyer thinks so," Preston confirmed. "It might take time and we'd need to present evidence of his treatment of you, but it can be done." Genevieve was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Then she straightened her shoulders, her jaw set with determination. "Then let's do it. I want to be completely free, not just in distance, but in name as well." The divorce proceedings began the following week. As expected, Harold Wilder fought the petition viciously, sending telegrams full of accusations and threats. But distance was on their side, and Genevieve's bruises had been witnessed by enough people in Deer Lodge that affidavits were secured supporting her claims of cruelty. The process was slower than they had hoped, complicated by legal maneuverings and Harold's influence, but they persevered. Through it all, their relationship deepened and strengthened. Preston courted Genevieve with small gestures, wildflowers left at her door, notes slipped to her at breakfast, walks in the evening where they talked about everything and nothing. 6 months after their arrival in Denver, on a snowy February evening, Preston waited nervously outside Mrs. Peterson's parlor. Ellis had invited them both to dinner, but Preston had asked Genevieve to meet him early. When she appeared, dressed in a new blue dress she had made herself, his breath caught in his throat. "You look beautiful," he said simply. Genevieve smiled, a confident, radiant expression so different from the fearful woman he had helped escape. "Thank you. Shall we go? I don't want to keep Ellis waiting." "Actually," Preston said, taking her hands in his, "I was hoping we could talk first." He led her into the parlor which Mrs. Peterson had discreetly vacated for their use. A small fire crackled in the grate, casting warm light over the modest room. "Preston, what is it?" Genevieve asked, sensing his nervousness. "I received a letter today," he told her, pulling an envelope from his pocket. "From the lawyer." Genevieve's grip on his hands tightened. "And what did it say?" "The divorce has been granted," Preston said, unable to keep the joy from his voice. "You're free, Genevieve, legally free." A soft gasp escaped her lips, followed by tears that spilled freely down her cheeks. "Truly, it's over." "It's over," he confirmed, pulling her into a gentle embrace. "Harold Wilder has no claim on you anymore." She buried her face against his chest, her shoulders shaking with emotion. When she finally looked up at him, her eyes were damp but her smile was radiant. "I never thought this day would come." "Neither did I," Preston admitted, "but now that it has." He took a deep breath, then slowly knelt before her, still holding one of her hands. "Genevieve Norton, I have loved you since the first moment I saw your kindness. I have admired your courage, your resilience, your gentle heart. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" For a long moment, Genevieve stood perfectly still, tears continuing to stream down her face. Then, with a cry that was half laugh, half sob, she pulled him to his feet and threw her arms around his neck. "Yes," she whispered against his ear. "Yes, Preston Abernathy, I will marry you." They were married in April, when the first wildflowers were beginning to bloom in the foothills around Denver. The ceremony was small Ellis and his wife, Mrs. Peterson, Mrs. Hartwell, and a few friends they had made in their new city. Silas and Martha made the journey from Blackwater Lodge, bringing with them news that Harold Wilder had lost most of his fortune in a failed cattle deal and had taken to drinking even more heavily than before. "Poetic justice," Silas had commented with a satisfied nod. As Preston slipped a simple gold band onto Genevieve's finger, he marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a desperate escape in the night to this bright spring day, their path had been difficult but ultimately rewarding beyond measure. "I promise to cherish and protect you," he vowed. "Not because you need protection, but because you deserve to be cherished. I promise to stand beside you as your partner, to support your dreams as you have supported mine, and to love you with all that I am for all the days of our lives." Genevieve's answering vows were equally heartfelt. "I promise to love you freely, with all the strength and courage you helped me find within myself. I promise to be your partner in all things, to face whatever comes beside you, and to never forget the man who said she deserves better when no one else would speak for me." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering erupted in cheers and applause. Preston kissed his bride tenderly, feeling as if his heart might burst with happiness. The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. Preston eventually saved enough to buy his own small livery business, while Genevieve opened a dressmaking shop that quickly gained a reputation for quality and fair prices. They bought a modest house on the outskirts of the growing city, with a view of the mountains and enough land to keep a few horses, including the chestnut stallion Silas had kept for Preston, finally sent to join them 2 years after their wedding. In their 3rd year of marriage, their son James was born, followed 2 years later by their daughter Sarah. Both children inherited their mother's blue eyes and their father's quiet determination. Preston delighted in teaching them to ride, while Genevieve read to them each night, instilling in them the same love of literature her mother had given her. They never returned to Deer Lodge, though they heard occasional news through Silas's letters. Harold Wilder had indeed lost everything, dying alone and forgotten 10 years after Genevieve's escape. Marcus Norton had passed away shortly after selling his store, never having reached out to the daughter he had essentially sold to save himself. These news items were acknowledged with solemn nods, but no real sorrow. The past was the past, and they had chosen to live in the present. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Preston took Genevieve riding in the foothills, to a secluded spot overlooking the city that had become their home. Now in their early 50s, they had weathered life's storms together: business setbacks, the loss of Preston's cousin Ellis, a difficult period when James had fallen in with a troublesome crowd before finding his way back to the family values. Through it all, their love had remained constant, growing deeper and richer with each passing year. "You ever regret it?" Preston asked as they sat side by side on a fallen log, much as they had during their flight from Deer Lodge so many years before. "Regret what?" Genevieve asked, her hand finding his as naturally as breathing. "Taking a chance on a cowboy with nothing to his name but a horse and a stubborn belief that you deserved better." Genevieve laughed, the sound still as beautiful to Preston as it had been the first time he heard it. "Never," she assured him, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Not for a single moment." Preston pressed a kiss to her hair, now streaked with silver but still honey gold in the sunlight. "Nor I," he said softly. "Every hardship, every struggle, every moment of fear during our escape, I would do it all again in a heartbeat to end up right here with you." Below them, Denver spread out across the plain, a testament to growth and possibility. Their children were grown now, James running the livery business, Sarah teaching at the local school, both happily married with children of their own. "We built a good life," Genevieve observed, her voice warm with contentment. "The best life," Preston agreed, "because we built it together." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Preston and Genevieve Abernathy remained side by side, their hands intertwined, their hearts still beating as one. From a desperate escape to a lifetime of love, theirs was a journey neither had expected, but both would forever cherish, all because one brave cowboy had dared to say, "She deserves better than that."